20 minutes before landing time, George gave the signal, and we all jumped up and started to knock down the people. They were down on the floor in 4 or 5 seconds flat. Just as I was searching these people through for the guns, somebody opened the door between the pilot cabin and the passenger cabin, looked out. The next moment the door was shut. The plane was pushed into a deep dive. And then all of a sudden start climb sharply up and down and up again. One moment we were up in the ceiling, the next moment we were down on the floor. Not only us, but those passengers who were knocked unconscious by them. George opened the door, and he's inside. He was faced with pilot, the co-pilot, the engineer, and the radio man. And the fifth one was the secret policeman with a gun in his hand, loaded, his finger on the trigger, and ready to kill the first man who moves in.
Are you listening, Uncle Sam? A program featuring the thoughts and voices of informed America will return after these words from our sponsor.
Ladies and gentlemen, on today's program, we are privileged to be able to present Mr. Frank Iszak, the man who, with his wife and 5 friends, in 1956 made worldwide headlines by hijacking a communist passenger plane in a desperate bid for freedom from behind the Iron Curtain. How this was accomplished, and what conditions inside communist-held Hungary led these young people to risk their lives in order to escape. These are the questions answered now by our guest speaker, Mr. Frank Iszak.
Thank you very much. The story which I start begins in 1956, 9 years ago, on a summer day back in Hungary. It was July the 13th, Friday. That afternoon, some of the Russian radar operators noticed a very strange phenomenon. One of the commercial airliners, the Hungarian Soviet commercial airliner, which was on its way from the capital of Hungary, Budapest, to another Hungarian city, all of a sudden disappeared from the radar scope. And it was a strange incident because nothing like that happened before, so the fellow was puzzled for a while before he reported this to the nearby military base. It took some time before they decided to send a squadron of jet fighters after this plane because they suspected that something went wrong with the plane. Indeed it did. But the mystery wasn't solved until 7 p.m. of the day, and then it was reported by a West German news agency that a Hungarian Soviet commercial airliner was hijacked over Hungarian territory. It was taken over by a small group of passengers, or a small group of people who posed as passengers, with a tremendous fight in midair, and it has been flown out from Hungary and landed in Western Germany. And as you know by now, the significance of it, and why I'm telling it, because I was a member of this hijacking team which took over the plane. I was a member of it with my wife. And for the benefit of all of you, I think I might tell how to hijack a plane. You never know when you come across doing one, needing one. You see, the terror of the communists in Hungary in 1956 was practically unbearable. But it was impossible to escape from behind the Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain, the barbed wires were practically closing off our land from the rest of the world. Approximately 1,200 people attempted to escape in the first 6 months of that year, and less than a dozen made it, which means that 99 out of 100 people were shot at the border or captured and shot later. And we knew this well, we were aware of it. So we decided, a small group of us, we decided we are going to try some way which has never been tried before. Hijack a commercial airliner. It sounded an incredible thing in the first place, because none of us knew how to fly except one fellow. Because we knew that among those passengers sitting there next to us, somebody is going to be a secret policeman, his identity unknown, but he is well armed and he is going to be ready to prevent anything we intended to do. So we made our plans accordingly. We figured that we're going to get on the airliner somehow. We're going to find an excuse, which we did. We're going to sit among the other passengers. At a given point, we're going to knock them all down, knock them on the head, knock them unconscious. Take the gun from the secret policeman, knock on the door. As they open the door, stick the gun in and tell them that, what this is, fellows, we take over the plane. Now, this is really simply we worked on it for 3 months on these plans. We had it down to every meticulous details, including how to knock down 4 people in 4 seconds and all. We knew that the maximum capacity of the plane could have been no more than 24, so we were 7 of us, so it couldn't be more than 17 other passengers. We got aboard the plane. The plane took off. 20 minutes before landing time, George gave the signal, and we all jumped up and started to knock down the people. They were down on the floor in 4 or 5 seconds flat. Just as I was searching these people through for the guns, somebody opened the door between the pilot cabin and the passenger cabin, looked out. The next moment, the door was shut. The plane was pushed into a deep dive. The pilots figured, and they knew what goes on, they figured that the only way to keep us off from our feet by jerking the plane, and they did. That plane went into a stall, falling hundreds and hundreds of feet down, and then all of a sudden start climb sharply up and down and up again. One moment we were up in the ceiling, the next moment we were down on the floor. Not only us, but those passengers who were knocked unconscious by them. And neither one of us able to move. I remember at one point George, who was supposed to fly the plane if we ever have it, he was trying to open the door with a screwdriver, and I was trying to move forward to help him, and something hit me, and I was out cold, didn't remember anything. When I came to, I saw that George opened the door, and he's inside, faced with pilot, the co-pilot, the engineer, and the radio man. And the 5th one was the secret policeman with a gun in his hand, loaded, his finger on the trigger, and ready to kill the first man who moves in. I have been asked many times over and over why he didn't. How come he didn't use his gun? And we had asked the same question from that secret policeman later in the hospital, and he couldn't answer. All he could say that somebody who was probably much stronger than him, or much stronger than any human being could be, reached there and stopped his hand from pulling that trigger. George jumped him. There was a tremendous fight between him and the rest of the crew there, and by the time we were able to go and help George, he was bleeding from about 18 holes in his head. The plane was 200 or 300 feet from the ground, ready to make an emergency landing on a cornfield over Hungary. But a few minutes later, the plane was ours, and some more minutes later, we were flying across the Iron Curtain. Down there it was, very clearly, the barbed wires, the machine gun towers, and then a second later, a land of darkness, a land of barbaric suffering, the land of pain and misery was behind us. The next country where we were to land, which we arrived, was Austria. That's where the borderline, the Iron Curtain, goes between Austria and Hungary. But we were not to land in Austria because Austria was a neutral nation, and we had our own concept of neutrality. We wanted to go as far as to the west, as far as possible. We wanted to go where the Americans are, Western Germany. That was hundreds of miles away, and we had a limited amount of gasoline to fly, so we had no navigation, we had no radio. I destroyed a radio in order to, in attempt to stop the radio men to give calling signals back in Hungary. We had no maps, we just flew toward the west, which we believed to be the west. And if you're familiar with the geographical situation of Middle Europe there, you know that the borderlines of Austria, Czechoslovakia, Eastern Germany, and Western Germany are pretty close to one another. And when you're flying up in 10,000 feet altitude without having any navigation or any map, you just really don't know over what country you are. At one point, about 3 hours later, we had to land the plane. We ran out of fuel. We spotted an airport down below. We landed the plane. I was the first one to get out of it, look around, and nobody was there. I went back to the plane and I told my fellow Hungarians there that We just have to get out here. We don't know where we are. There is no sign of any human being here. What country are we at? The question grew tremendously. It was a fearful, a tremendous question in our heart. I remember that we were practically shaking as more and more we realized that we might be just as well behind the Iron Curtain still in some other country. Very fearful moments. It took about 10 minutes before the first person came up to us. The person was driving an automobile. He was driving a Jeep. From the end of the runway he came, closer and closer. At one point it was there. We could recognize it. And that was the moment when I fell down to my knees. That was the moment when my tears started to pour down on my face. That was the moment when I became a child, crying there like I never cried before. The tears of joy, happiness. And through those tears I could see the reason of it. The sign, the only sign of true freedom which we dreamed so much about before. The only sign, the only signal which meant freedom for us, which meant something which we never had before in our life. From the aerial of the small Jeep, blown by the gentle wind of that afternoon, there was a small American flag flying. We just cried there like children. Of course, in order to explain and understand why a man could become so emotional, which I am not ashamed of, you have to understand some more. You have to know some more of the background of a man. What does make a person to leave his country? What does make a person to sacrifice everything he had, including his relatives, his parents, everything he had there? What kind of a life he had to have, what kind of a country he had to have, and what kind of a man he was.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've been listening to Mr. Frank Iszak, one of the small team of Hungarians who in 1956 successfully hijacked a plane out of communist-held Hungary in a desperate bid for freedom from behind the Iron Curtain. Listen in next week to the concluding portion of this lecture by Frank Iszak.
Are You Listening, Uncle Sam? A program featuring the thoughts and voices of informed America is produced by the John Birch Society and created for radio by Ed Griffin.
Major portions of today's program were condensed from the LP recording entitled With No Mercy, a lecture by Frank Iszak, and was used with permission of the speaker. If you would like information on how to obtain the full unedited version for your record library, just send a stamped self-addressed envelope to the John Birch Society, San Marino, California. That's the John Birch Society.